Well, welcome back. I'm Cheryl Strachan, registered dietitian, and this is video number 3 in how to eat well for life after a heart event. And I have been a dietitian for 15 years. The first 9 were at the cardiac rehab program here in Calgary. And then 6 years I have been in private practice here with Sweet Spot Nutrition, working with people who have heart concerns. So I gathered together some of the most frequently asked questions because I know this can be kind of a stressful time. There's so much information and it often doesn't agree. You'll hear one thing from one source and one thing from another, and it's sometimes really frustrating as well as confusing. So my goal is to put your mind to ease at least about these few things, and then we will go from there. So quick heads up on what's coming. I could have done this for 2 hours, but I thought we'll try to go with the most commonly asked questions. So, isn't there too much sugar in fruit? What about potatoes and other starchy vegetables? Another carbohydrate question. And while we're on the carbohydrate topic, what if I'm on a low carb or ketogenic diet? I'll give you my 2 cents on that approach. Butter or margarine, probably the most commonly asked question I think we dietitians get. And I'll do a little detour and talk about some of the science around saturated fat, which is the kind of fat that's in butter, and that's been a source of a lot of controversy in the last few years. And that'll help us answer the butter and margarine question as well as this one. Do I need to go with non-fat or low-fat dairy? What about red meat? Eggs. We got to talk about eggs if we're going to talk frequently asked questions, right? And then how can I make food taste good without salt? So, and I'll talk a little bit about sea salt in there too, and just make sure you understand the distinction. And finally, what about a whole food, plant-based diet? And if you're not sure what I mean there, if you've seen the documentary Forks Over Knives, or you've heard about the reversing heart disease diet, that's what I'm talking about. And we'll give you a little bit of information where the science is with that. Okay, sound good? Let's jump in. One of the most consistent pieces of advice you'll hear about eating for heart health is more fruit and vegetables, more fruit and vegetables. But sometimes astute people will ask, what about the sugar in the fruit? Is that a problem? I would say no, and here's how I would think of it. Nutritionally, we make a distinction between sugar that is naturally found in fruit, as well as milk and yogurt, versus what we call added or free sugars, which are added to foods in manufacturing or in the kitchen. They're the same molecules, but the difference is in the package. With fruit, as well as milk and yogurt, you're getting a host of beneficial nutrients along with that sugar, from fiber to vitamins and minerals and more, all in a whole food package that takes time to eat, digest, and be absorbed into your bloodstream. With added or free sugar, it's basically rapidly absorbed empty calories, which most of us don't need more of. I do always like to say, however, they can play a role in enjoyment, celebration, tradition, and those things matter too for well-being. So all of our guidelines, from Canada's Heart and Stroke Foundation to the American Heart Association, suggest limiting free or added sugars, but not banning them completely. And they don't say anything about limits on whole fruit. Of course, everything can be taken to the extreme, and we're not suggesting that. But in typical amounts, there's more benefit from fruit than there is worry about the sugar. Okay, but what if you have diabetes or you're worried about your risk for it? Fruit is still beneficial for people with diabetes, but you may want to moderate a little bit. So Diabetes Canada, for example, says, okay, fill half your plate with fruit or vegetables, but maybe make it more vegetables than fruit. Typically, my advice is have one serving at a time if you're worried about blood sugar management. And so you might have some fruit with breakfast, maybe some fruit as an afternoon snack, a little bit of fruit after dinner, one serving each time, and that way you spread out the sugar while still taking advantage of some of the cardioprotective benefits. The bottom line, fruit is still beneficial for people with diabetes. A 2014 systematic review cited in the Diabetes Canada guidelines found that even in people with diabetes, a higher intake of fruit is associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. The one caution I would suggest is with fruit juice. Even if you squeeze it yourself, even if no sugar is added, or it says 100% fruit juice, because when they juice it, they leave behind much of the fiber. And when it's liquid form, it's so easy to consume so much more. Take this bottle of orange juice, for example, 450 mils or about 2 cups. That's equivalent nutritionally to eating 3 or 4 medium-sized oranges, something most of us wouldn't do. Except with the juice, it's absorbed much more rapidly. So save the fruit juice for special occasions, or if you like to take it with your pills, and I know some people do like to drink juice with their pills, just stick with a small glass. and for the most part, enjoy your fruit whole. So a similar question often comes up about potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, and other starchy vegetables. Do we count them as a vegetable or are they a starch? So botanically, they're vegetables, but nutritionally, they're much more like bread and other grain products. If you take a peek at this Canada's Food Guide picture, you can see that they've put the potatoes over there with the vegetables near the bottom. There's sweet potatoes there too. But when we say half your plate vegetables, we really don't mean half a plate of mashed potatoes. No, the idea is a variety of vegetables and fruit. And if you have diabetes or you're at risk for it, I would think about that quarter of the plate where grains are found, including your starchy vegetables there. Kind of like in this model from the American Diabetes Association. So here are a few examples using real food. I always like to translate this into actual pictures of food. So the first is what's typical with potatoes. They become French fries and they grow well beyond that quarter of a plate to occupy about half a plate, at least with typical restaurant meals. Plus, you see, there's bread on that plate. So about 3/4 of this plate is taken up by starchy, carbohydrate-rich foods, which is one reason you're so much better off at home. You don't usually do quite this much at home. In this meal, however, the potatoes take up just about a quarter of the plate, so that's a better balance. Similarly, with this breakfast on the right, the sweet potatoes, and they're just again about a quarter of the plate, balanced with half plate there of cauliflower and spinach. But keep in mind, potatoes do offer nutrition beyond just energy. There's fiber, potassium, vitamin C, sweet potatoes even more so. So enjoy your potatoes and other starchy vegetables. Just think in terms of shifting the balance more toward the non-starchy vegetables. So while we're on the topic of fruit and potatoes, carbohydrate-containing foods, someone will inevitably ask, what about low-carb diets, one of which is a ketogenic diet? So first of all, what is a low-carbohydrate diet? On the left here, you see a variety of foods that contain carbohydrate, from bread and pasta, which I think most people think of when they think of carbohydrate foods, maybe potatoes and rice and other grain products. And then some others that are not as commonly thought of as carbohydrate-containing foods, but certainly are. Lentils and other legumes like chickpeas, black beans, fruit, milk, yogurt. Those are all carbohydrate-containing foods that would be off the table in a low-carbohydrate diet. So what do you eat instead? A lot of vegetables, at least in a heart healthier interpretation of a low-carb diet, and some lean protein and healthy fat foods like nuts and avocado, as well as the fish there, which gives you both protein and healthy fats. So what's the appeal? Well, low-carbohydrate diets are pretty effective in the short run at producing weight loss, and that's exciting for people and their doctors. This is a chart from a typical study done in 2010 comparing a low-carbohydrate diet to a conventional weight loss diet, and the people in this program had a great deal of support, so they lost more weight than someone would who was just out in the community without as much support. But you can see the trend there. After 3 months and 6 months, the low-carbohydrate diet group was on average losing more weight than the low-fat diet group. But by 12 months and then at 24 months, they are, statistically speaking, about in the same place, both groups tending to regain the weight. So with that generally comes back the blood pressure, the blood sugar, and the cholesterol control. So in the short run, we know we can see some improvement in risk factors, but what happens in the long run? We can't really say for sure. We haven't had a randomized controlled trial of a dietary intervention like a low carb or a ketogenic diet that lasts longer than 2 years or tracks outcomes like cardiac events or mortality. So we don't really know. In population studies, people who eat very low or very high carbohydrate diets tend to have higher mortality than people who eat moderate amount of carbohydrates. But this is kind of an open question. So if it feels to you like this diet is really appealing, if you looked at those foods and said, I love those foods and this could work for me, then it's an option. But know that we don't have as much long-term outcome data. And, really at the end of the day, the most important thing in all these, various dietary choices is to find one that suits you best so that you can be happy eating that way for the rest of your life. Okay, so while we're on the topic of high protein foods, let's talk about eggs. This has been a thorn in the side of people living with high cholesterol and heart disease for decades, which is, unfortunate because eggs are actually a very nutritious food and they're relatively affordable. But as you probably know, egg yolks are unusually high in cholesterol. So logically, a person might think that eating them would increase blood cholesterol levels. Let's see what the research says. So it's more about the overall cholesterol in a person's diet, but if that's high and that comes from eggs as well as meat, fish, and chicken, that can sometimes drive blood cholesterol levels up a little bit, more in some people than others, but other things like saturated fat in the diet play a bigger role. But if high cholesterol is a concern for you, it might be worth exploring. But again, what we really want to know is this, right? The long-term effect on outcomes. And it would be great if we had a randomized controlled trial where someone had randomly assigned half the people to eat eggs and half not to, and then followed them for long enough to see how many cardiac events they had. But we don't have that. So what we have is observational studies. And that's the kind of study where researchers ask volunteers about their eating habits and then follow their health outcomes for years or decades even. So these studies are helpful, but understand they're not airtight, right? Are people giving an accurate description of their eating habits, for example? If they're eating a lot of eggs, are they also eating a lot of bacon and sausage and white bread, other things that might cause the results that are seen? Or if they're not eating a lot of eggs, what are they eating instead? Is it Fruit Loops for breakfast or steel-cut oats? So you can see why different studies give different findings. It's a bit frustrating, but in this case, it's the best we got. And when we get consistent answers from observational studies, we can start to be more confident in our understanding. But with eggs in particular, we do get really inconsistent findings, at least for people with heart disease and diabetes. So in healthy volunteers, most of the studies show an egg a day or 7 a week does not seem to cause a problem with long-term outcomes. But with people who have heart disease or diabetes, some studies do link more eggs or really more cholesterol in the diet to a slightly higher risk of coronary heart disease, and some don't. And when findings are inconsistent like that, my take is usually a little bit probably won't make a big difference one way or the other. So how much is a little bit? So in terms of numbers here, the American Heart Association issued an advisory just in January 2020, suggesting an egg a day for healthy people is fine, maybe more for vegetarians because they're not getting cholesterol from meat, fish, or chicken, but they did advise caution for those with diabetes, dyslipidemia, which just means abnormal cholesterol or triglycerides, or people at risk for heart failure. They don't give a specific number, but really I think that's up to you. Look at how much you like eggs, how conservative you want to be, the other factors that matter to you. Another source we often look to is the Harvard School of Public Health. They do a lot of these observational studies. They recommend just 3 eggs a week for people who have diabetes and heart disease. Canada's Heart and Stroke Foundation, on the other hand, doesn't suggest a limit. They just say have a variety of protein-rich foods. So look, this is, again, a highly nutritious food. So in the context of an overall heart-healthy diet, I think it's fine to enjoy eggs in moderation. It's not likely to make a big difference one way or the other. Let's shift gears and talk about what is probably the most frequently asked question I've ever had: butter or margarine? And it's kind of funny that this is such a popular question because honestly, the short answer is it's not likely to make a big difference if you're just eating small amounts of either one. For the long answer, and to understand that, let's dig a little bit into the nutrition here. So the fats in our food are divided into these 3 groups based on their structure. On the left there, the unsaturated fats are generally agreed upon to be heart healthy, like I talked about in video 2. And on the right are the artificial trans fats, which again, widely agreed that these raise your risk significantly, so they are finally being phased out in Canada and the US. In the middle, however, is where the controversy lies. So since 1961, the experts at the American Heart Association have been telling us to take it easy on saturated fat to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. And this type of fat, saturated fat, that's what we have the most of in butter, as well as other animal products like cream and cheese and bacon and sausage and red meat, as well as some plant foods like palm oil and coconut oil. So the American Heart Association's strong recommendation is based on good evidence that eating more foods rich in this kind of fat, saturated fat, raises LDL cholesterol, which is well established as a risk factor for heart disease. So this kind of study can be done in a few months, and it has been replicated many times, a randomized controlled trial. But what we've been missing is high quality evidence that Cutting back on saturated fat does indeed reduce the outcomes we really care about: cardiac events, morbidity, mortality. Remember, that kind of study would take many more years, many volunteers, and at this point, I think might not even be considered ethical to do in light of what we know about saturated fats raising LDL. But in the last decade or so, we've seen publication of several population studies. And in those kinds of studies, we see, hey, people who ate lower saturated fat diets and lower fat diets in general, they don't actually have lower rates of heart disease. That was quite a surprise, right? We saw headlines like this until we looked more closely at the data and saw two things. First of all, the type of fat you're eating is really just one small component of your overall lifestyle. So like I say, maybe not a big deal if you're not having a lot of it. Second, what really matters is what you are eating, not what you cut out, right? I mean, these are both low saturated fat foods. So the real question is, if you cut back on saturated fat to help lower your cholesterol, what are you going to eat instead? Turns out if it's more sugar and other refined carbohydrates, your risk doesn't actually go down. It might even go up by a little bit. Only when that saturated fat is replaced with unsaturated fats and to a lesser extent whole grains, that's when we see cardiovascular disease go down. So let me just translate this into real food. I think it's easier this way. So take this lovely breakfast sandwich here. It's pretty high in saturated fat, right? There's probably butter in the biscuit. There's bacon, egg, cheese. So if you said, look, I'm going to go for a healthier breakfast, and you did what so many of us did, myself included, in the 1990s, and went instead with, say, a bagel, fat-free cream cheese maybe even, right? That's not helpful. It turns out having more of those refined carbohydrates, I'm assuming those are not whole grain bagels, that's actually putting you in worse position heart disease-wise. On the other hand, if you were to swap out the original breakfast sandwich for something that had healthy fats like peanut butter, as well as some fruit there and whole grains, now you'd be likely to lower your risk. So getting back to the original question, what we do with the butter, certainly if you were to switch to a traditional margarine, which is made with hydrogenated oils and high in trans fats, these hard blocks here, you would be worse off. And this is where margarine rightfully got its bad name. But for 20 years or so now, we've had margarine made by simply blending together various oils, none of which have been hydrogenated. So this is a much less processed product than the margarines of yesterday. So this would actually be expected to lower cardiovascular risk because it's made with mostly healthy fat. Although, like I say, if you're not eating much of either, it's unlikely to make much of a difference. So go with what you prefer. So if you prefer butter, that's fine. Just don't have a lot of it. And when you can, switch to something like olive oil or peanut butter, so you're getting those healthy fats, but something that's even less processed. Or you can do what I do and make your own margarine at home. If you go to my website, sweetspotnutrition.ca, and search for the Better Butter recipe, you'll see that you can do that kind of blending of different oils in your own kitchen and make a really minimally processed margarine. And I love it because it's kind of buttery in taste and it's spreadable like margarine. So while we're on the topic of saturated fat, how about this question? Do I need to go with non-fat or low-fat dairy, milk, yogurt, cheese? This is a question for which, honestly, we still don't have a clear answer. Conventional wisdom says yes, choose the lower fat options, maybe because of the link between saturated fat and cholesterol, or perhaps because the original DASH studies were conducted using mostly lower fat milk products. Although I always like to say they did have an ounce of cheese every day. But other studies have shown that higher fat dairy products work just as well to lower blood pressure and might even be helpful in other ways, particularly yogurt. So go with your personal preference here. If you like cheese and you prefer higher fat versions of milk and yogurt, have them. If not, don't. It doesn't appear to make a big difference one way or the other. What really matters more here is the big picture. So imagine someone eating cheese as part of a meat lover's pizza delivered to their desk late at night. That's going to be different than a person who eats cheese with walnuts and grapes as a planned afternoon snack. And how about this related question? What about red meat? Similarly, there are pros and cons and no real clear answer. It's a good source of nutrients like protein, iron, and zinc, but it's typically high in saturated fat. However, we've just seen that cutting saturated fat is really only beneficial if you're replacing it with healthier fats. So a switch from beef to fish might make sense, or maybe from beef to chicken with peanut sauce, or chicken with a salad tossed in vinaigrette. But if you're switching from beef to, say, a noodle bowl, not so much. So generally where I net out on this one is aim for less than 2 servings a week, just to leave room for those protein foods that have been linked to improved heart health, like fish, nuts, and beans. Another diet that's popular with people after a heart event is what's called the whole food plant-based diet, and some people add the no oil at the end when describing it. If you've seen the documentary Forks Over Knives, or you've read either of these books, then you're probably familiar with this diet. But for anyone who's not, here are basically the foods that you don't eat. So it's no animal food, so fish, chicken, and dairy are off the list, as well as any fat-rich foods like nuts, seeds, avocados, and oil. So what's left to eat, you might ask? Actually, quite a lot. Vegetables and fruit, as well as whole grains and legumes, dried peas, beans, and lentils. And you'd be surprised at the creative things they can do with these foods. So this is a vegan diet, but it doesn't usually go by that name because it also bans processed food. So for example, Beyond Meat burgers and potato chips are vegan, but they wouldn't be included in this whole foods plant-based diet. So what does the evidence tell us about this approach? Again, we have some good evidence that it can bring about short-term changes like better blood sugar control and weight loss. A very restrictive diet will do that, at least for some people. In the long run, there is some evidence, although not as strong, but suffice to say, this is definitely a healthy option, but not the only option, and generally not the one I lead with because it is so much more restrictive. And the evidence doesn't really support the fat restrictions, so if you want to do a whole food plant-based diet, I wouldn't feel like you have to cut out nuts and seeds or even oil for that matter. And if you do go this route, I would suggest working with a dietitian who specializes in vegan diets just to make sure you cover your bases nutritionally. If you do, this can be a really healthy way to go. So I'll bring back these general principles describing foods that support heart health. You can adapt them to fit your taste preferences, lifestyle, and budget. We actually have a lot of flexibility. So if you want to leave something out, whether it be dairy or meat or seafood, you can, but the evidence isn't strong enough to say that that's necessary. At the end of the day, what matters most is eating in your sweet spot. So another question I often get is not so much about a controversy, but just in the kitchen, how can I make food taste good without salt? And first of all, I always like to correct that assumption. And it's not that you can't use salt. It's just that we're looking for an overall reduction of sodium relative to at least the average person. So let's just make sure you're clear between the two, right? So table salt is sodium chloride, but there are other sources of sodium in our diet, especially if you eat a lot of processed foods. Things like monosodium glutamate, or MSG, is another source of sodium. But most of our sodium in our diet comes from table salt. So how much is too much? So the American Heart Association is kind of conservative on this one. They suggest no more than 1,500 milligrams for most adults. The World Health Organization and Hypertension Canada are a little bit less conservative at 2,000. And the Institute of Medicine, who sets many of our guidelines for nutrients, RDAs and others, says the upper limit of what's safe is 2,300 milligrams. So our food labels say 2,400. I think partly that's because it's just nice, even math. So if you see a food and it says 50% next to sodium per serving, what that tells you is there's 1,200 milligrams of sodium. So I just included these other numbers for fun. The average Canadian daily intake is 2,760. That's according to our most recent surveys. Average American a little higher at 3,400. And I picked one of the saltiest dishes I've ever found at a restaurant, the Hunan Kung Pao with prawns at Earl's Restaurant, which is a Canadian chain, which has more than twice as much as is typically recommended, or 3 times as much as that American Heart Association limit. I do this partly to illustrate that most of our sodium in our diet comes from restaurant and processed foods, about 70 or 80%, depending on which survey. So actually using salt and using a salt shaker in the home is not the biggest source. And just to give you a sense of how much, it helps to know that a teaspoon of salt is 2,330 milligrams of sodium. That's regular table salt. Sometimes for making the math easy, I just round it up to 2,400. So let's say you're making a pot of soup and there's going to be 8 cups of soup at the end of that. So let's say you put in half a teaspoon of salt. Call it 1,200 milligrams of sodium. Divided by 8 cups, that means there's going to be 150 milligrams of sodium in each one. So you can see relative to some of these numbers, that's a pretty decent number. So don't shy away from using a little bit of salt in your home cooking if you know that overall you're using a minimal amount of processed foods. Okay, so back to the real question, which was how else can you season the food? So a little bit of salt is okay, but there's lots of other things we can do to get flavor into our food without much sodium. So cooking with things like onion, garlic, and ginger will add some, or sometimes having them raw in your meals really gives a punch, depending on the recipe. You can cook with wine, of course, and other liquids you can cook with are more the acidic ones. Vinegar, and try the different kinds of vinegar. We love rice vinegar in this house. Balsamic vinegar is a classic. Red wine vinegar is really nice. Or lemon or lime juice can really make a flavor pop in something. Or you can grate the rind of a lemon or a lime, or an orange for that matter. They call that zest, right? Lemon zest or lime zest. Adding that to something will really bring up the flavor. You can add hot peppers, and if you don't have fresh peppers on hand, those little crushed red pepper flakes that come in the spice aisle are really good. There are lots of salt-free spice blends. Just make sure they're actually salt-free ones. Mrs. Dash is one option, but there's other good ones out there. And finally, some people ask this question about the product no salt or half salt. So those are made of potassium chloride. Some people find them an okay alternative to salt, but a couple cautions. Number one, some people shouldn't have extra potassium in their diet. So I would definitely check with your doctor before adding a lot of extra potassium in the form of a salt like that. Number two, some people find a metallic or bitter aftertaste. So if you can get your flavor from other foods and vegetables and herbs, that's kind of ideal. And when you need to use salt or something salty like Parmesan cheese or soy sauce, a little bit goes a long way. And as long as you're cooking mostly from scratch, it's okay to use a little bit of those things too. So while we're on this topic, often the question of sea salt comes up. So I just wanted to quickly make sure you know, both table salt and sea salt are sodium chloride. They're both about 40% sodium. So it's not necessarily a lower salt alternative. Sometimes when you read the labels of sea salt, it'll look like it has less sodium. That's only because a lot of our sea salts are coarse salts. So when they measure a teaspoon of it, there's more air in the spoon because it's not as dense with those crystals. So sometimes it'll look like a little bit less sodium, but by weight, they're basically the same. There's a little bit of mineral difference. Sometimes there are little trace amounts of things like magnesium, potassium, calcium, but certainly not enough to impact health. We'd get much greater amounts of those minerals in real food. So don't waste your money on pink Himalayan sea salt and other fancy things. You may find you really like the taste if you've got a sensitive palate, or maybe you like the texture of a coarser salt, or the kosher salt has a nice taste and texture, but for nutrition reasons, they're basically equivalent. Well, thank you for watching. I hope that answered some of your questions, and I hope you're starting to see that eating after a hard event doesn't have to be complicated or overly restrictive, that in fact it can be satisfying and a source of pleasure even, not a source of stress. So if you listened to this and thought, yeah, that confirms what I'm doing, what I know, and you're on the right track, then awesome. But if you sat through it and now you're saying, gosh, I'm still so far from this and I still have a lot of questions, then I'd like to invite you to join me for a special group program I'm starting next week. I would like to help get you to your sweet spot, where you're eating in a way that supports heart health, that you love the food, and that it's right for you in other ways that matter to you. So there'll be information about it coming via email. Stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and thanks again for watching.